When people watch courtroom dramas on television, the endings are usually pretty simple. The jury comes back, the verdict is read, someone wins, someone loses, and then the credits roll. But real life is not that simple. My first trial ended with a hung jury. And if you've never gone through the court system before, you may not even understand what that means. At 24 years old, I certainly didn't. All I heard was we couldn't reach a verdict. 24 years old, couldn't reach a verdict. And what my brain translated that into was that I would never get justice. By the time we got to trial, I had already been living this case for almost 3 years. 3 years of custody battles and delays, 3 years of preparing, 3 years of desperately trying to protect my sisters while simultaneously reliving some of the worst experiences of my life. We would get a trial date, and then it would get postponed, and then it would get postponed again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And it honestly felt like this case would never actually happen. So when we finally made it to trial, I think a huge part of me believed that once I testified and we went through this, that this nightmare would finally be over. Not because I expected it to be easy, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but because I expected that there would be an ending. But there wasn't. I don't even remember exactly where I was when I learned that the jury was hung. I remember that we drove to the courthouse several times while they deliberated, thinking it was going to be done soon. Every day we went, we thought there'd be an answer, and every day they needed more time. Eventually, I couldn't just sit around waiting. I had to work. My sisters had school. We still had bills to pay. Justice was very important, but justice wasn't going to put food on the table. As it was, we were barely scraping by, and life didn't stop just because the jury couldn't make a decision. When I first heard the words hung jury, my first thought wasn't about my father. It wasn't about prison. It wasn't even about me. My first thought was, now what happens to the girls? I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to protect them, that somehow this hung jury would undo everything that we'd fought for. We'd spent 3 years of court hearings and custody battles and investigations and testimony, and I was so worried that none of it would matter, that I would lose custody and they would get sent back into that situation that had already caused so much damage. At 24 years old, I didn't understand that a hung jury wasn't necessarily the end of our story. In the movies, they don't teach you that part. In the movies, a hung jury feels like a failure, like the case is over and everyone goes home. And I honestly didn't even know there was a possibility of trying the case again. And frankly, I was exhausted, not only from testifying, but from watching my sisters testify. I wasn't able to be in the room with them, but one of them was cross-examined so aggressively that she ended up crying on the stand. I remember her telling me afterwards that she'd been asked to answer deeply personal questions about her private life, questions that were completely unrelated to whether the abuse had occurred, questions that seemed intentionally designed to embarrass her, to confuse her maybe, to make her doubt herself, and honestly to make the jury doubt her. At the time, I was furious. Now, years later, I do understand something that I couldn't necessarily appreciate then, and that was that the defense attorney was doing his job. And unfortunately, he was very good at it. When I was 24, hearing that there's a hung jury, I thought the jurors were idiots. I really did. I mean, how could they not see what seemed to me to be so obvious? How could they not spend weeks listening to testimony and be so confused? How could they get hung up on things like intent or dates or technical definitions? It honestly felt absurd. 38-year-old me does see it differently. Not because I think the outcome was right, obviously, but because I do understand what happened. The defense attorney didn't have to prove my father was innocent. He just had to create doubt. He focused relentlessly on the word intent. The argument wasn't really that things had happened. The argument was somehow that my father hadn't intended to cause harm, as if repeated bad behavior year after year could somehow be accidental, as if intent only somehow exists if somebody admits to it. I don't agree with that reasoning, but I do understand why the juries struggled with it. Years later, as I prepared for this video, I went back and I found emails from someone who attended the trial nearly every day. He wasn't family, he wasn't a friend of mine, he was simply someone who knew my father and had become so invested in the case after the lies my father told his church congregation didn't make sense to him anymore. One observation he made stuck with me. He wrote to me saying that the defense wasn't just defending my father. The defense was continuing a story that I'd been hearing my whole life, that I was the problem, that I was the liar, that I was the one destroying the family. And for the first time, I think I heard someone outside the family recognize that for what was happening. I remember getting updates from the prosecutor while the jury deliberated. The questions they asked and sent out felt surreal. They wanted clarifications about intent. They wanted clarifications about legal definitions. At one point, they were asking questions about anatomy and how specific charges could be interpreted. They weren't debating my memories. They were debating legal instructions, and that is a very different thing. But when you're the victim sitting outside waiting for the verdict, it doesn't feel any different. It just feels like your life is hanging in the balance. When the hung jury was finally declared, I felt devastated. Not because I thought the prosecutor had failed. Honestly, she was fantastic. She was wonderful. She was communicative. She fought so hard and she believed in us. And she believed in me, and I trusted her completely. What devastated me was this unknown. What happens next? Do we just move on with our lives and pretend none of this ever happened? I had no idea. And then the prosecutor said something that I'll never forget. She was very clear that we are not done and that we are going to try again. And I just remember feeling so much relief, not because I wanted to do it again, because I definitely did not, but because for the first time since hearing those words, hung jury, I realized that this story was not yet over. She was surprisingly confident, far more confident than I was. She believed now that she understood where the confusion came from, that she could address it the second time round. And she believed that we had a very strong path forward. And at the moment when I thought things were initially over, she's the one who told me they are definitely not over. Looking back now, I think that's the lesson I carry from the hung jury. Justice isn't always denied. Sometimes it's delayed. Sometimes people are confused or the legal system moves painfully slowly. And sometimes the truth gets buried under technicalities, legal arguments, and definitions. And sometimes you have to tell your story more than once, unfortunately. I am incredibly grateful that this isn't where my story ends. Because if the prosecutor had told us that our case wasn't strong enough and that we couldn't try again, if they had walked away, I honestly don't know how I would feel about the justice system today. But they didn't, and they stayed, and they fought for me, and they fought for us. And eventually, the jury convicted him. When I think back to this chapter in my life, I think that's the memory that remains strongest. Not the hung jury or the confusion or the delays, but the fact that when things got hard, the people who mattered didn't give up. And because of that, my story wasn't over. Thank you for being here with me. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my story helps you to tell yours.